The hiss of steam was the only farewell she received. Ruth Ann stood on the raw timber platform, her small trunk beside her like a loyal dog, and watched the train shrink into a black smudge against the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. The dust it kicked up settled slowly, coating her dark traveling dress in a film of pale grit. The town of Redemption, what there was of it, shimmered in the heat. A single wide street was flanked by false-fronted buildings that looked like they had been thrown up in a hurry and left to bake. She clutched her reticule, the letter inside suddenly feeling thin and fragile. It had felt so substantial back in Ohio, a promise of a new life. Mr. Elias Abernathy, a man of some standing if his stationery was to be believed, required a governess for his 2 motherless children. The position came with room, board, and a wage that seemed a fortune. He was to meet her at the station. He had assured her of it in his final correspondence. The station master, a man with a face like a dried apple, had already retreated into the shade of his office. The scrape of his chair was a final dismissive sound. A few people lingered on the street, their gazes sliding over her before moving on. She was a curiosity, a piece of luggage left behind, and their interest was already waning. She smoothed the front of her dress, a useless gesture against the dust and the creeping dread. The sun was relentless, pressing down on her shoulders. No one came. An hour passed, then another. The shadows of the buildings stretched, turning the dust from tan to gold. Men on horseback rode past, their faces leathered by the sun, their eyes sweeping over her with the same casual assessment they might give a stray calf. Women in sunbonnets hurried into the mercantile, shielding their faces and ignoring hers. Ruth Ann felt herself shrinking, becoming part of the dusty scenery. She was a ghost who had arrived on a train meant for the living. A wagon, heavily laden with supplies, rattled to a stop before the largest store. The man who climbed down was built on a scale that matched the landscape. He was tall and broad, moving with a heavy certainty that made the ground seem to vibrate. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face carved from granite and stubbled with a week's worth of beard. He didn't look at her. He walked straight past the platform, his spurs ringing a lonely metallic tune on the boardwalk. He disappeared into the mercantile, the bell on the door jangling sharply. He was the loneliest-looking man she had ever seen, a man who seemed to carry a vast and empty space around him. Ruth Ann shifted her weight, the soles of her shoes hot through the thin leather. She had to do something. She could not simply stand here until nightfall. She considered the hotel across the street, its windows staring like vacant eyes. But her funds were meager, meant only to last until her first week's wages. The letter from Mr. Abernathy was her only currency, and its value was depreciating with every passing minute. The big rancher emerged from the mercantile, a sack of flour on one shoulder and a crate of tinned goods tucked under his other arm, as if they were weightless. He moved toward his wagon, his path taking him past her again. He still didn't look. He was a planet in his own orbit, and she was not a star in his sky. Just as he drew level with the platform, a sudden gust of wind, hot and smelling of sage, whipped down the street. It tore the letter from her trembling fingers. The paper skittered across the dusty ground, tumbling end over end until it came to rest against the toe of his large, worn boot. He stopped. For a long moment, he just stood there, looking down at the white rectangle as if it were a snake. Then, With a sigh that seemed to hoist a great weight, he set down his crate, bent and picked it up. He turned, and for the first time, his eyes met hers. They were the color of a stormy sky and held a weariness so profound it stole her breath. He took 2 steps toward her and held out the letter. His knuckles were bruised, his hands calloused and powerful. She reached for it, her fingers brushing his. A jolt, small and sharp as a static spark, passed between them. His gaze dropped to the letter in his hand, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read the name written in a flourishing script. Abernathy, he read aloud, his voice a low rumble like rocks grinding together. He looked back at her, and something flickered in that grey gaze. Not pity, not kindness, but a flat, weary recognition, as if he had seen this story play out 100 times before. He said nothing more. He simply placed the letter in her hand, turned without another word, loaded his wagon, and drove away. He left her in a cloud of dust and an even deeper silence. The finality of his departure broke her paralysis. He knew the name Abernathy, and the look on his face had told her everything she needed to know. She was a fool who had crossed a continent on a liar's promise. With a deep breath that tasted of grit and failure, Ruth Ann picked up her trunk. The handle was rough against her palm. She was alone, but she was not yet broken. She walked toward the boarding house at the end of the street. Its painted sign, Maud's Rooms, was faded but legible. Each step was an act of will, a refusal to dissolve into the dust at her feet. The woman who answered the door was named Maud, and she had arms as thick as posts and a gaze that missed nothing. Ruth Ann explained her situation, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Maud listened, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression unreadable. Abernathy, Maud said, the name a curse on her tongue. Skipped town 3 weeks ago, owed me for a month's lodging, and left behind a pile of whiskey bottles and lies. She looked Ruth Ann up and down, taking in the decent, if dusty dress, and the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. Got no charity rooms, miss. Town's full of folks with sad stories. She was about to close the door when a terrible sound erupted from inside the house. A harsh, barking cough, the sound of a small body fighting for air. Maud's face, hard as packed earth, crumpled with worry. Timothy, she breathed, turning and rushing back into the dim hallway. Ruth Ann hesitated for only a second before following. In a small, stuffy room, a little boy of about 5 was sitting up in bed, his face pale and his lips tinged with blue, each breath a desperate, rasping struggle. It's the croup, Maud said, her voice frantic as she wrung her hands. Gets him every year. Doctors clear over in Silver Creek till Saturday. Ruth Ann didn't think, she acted. Boil a kettle of water, she commanded, her voice crisp with an authority that surprised them both. And bring me the strongest mustard you have, some flour, a clean rag, and a thick blanket. Maud, startled by her tone, simply nodded and hurried to the kitchen. Ruth Ann knelt by the boy, speaking to him in a low, calm voice, her hand cool on his feverish forehead. Her mother had been a healer, a woman who understood the language of herbs and fevers, and she had taught her daughter well. This was a knowledge she carried inside her, a hidden strength. When Maud returned, Ruth Ann worked quickly. She mixed the mustard and flour into a paste, spread it on the rag, and laid the warm poultice on the boy's chest. She had Maud hold the blanket over the head of the bed while she directed the steam from the kettle underneath. creating a small, humid tent. She kept talking to Timothy, her voice a steady anchor in his sea of panic. Slowly, miraculously, the harsh barking cough began to soften. The terrible rasp in his breathing eased, and colour began to return to his cheeks. An hour later, Timothy was asleep, his breathing deep and even. Maud stood in the doorway, staring at the woman who had walked in off the street. She looked from her sleeping son to Ruth Ann, whose face was smudged with soot and beaded with sweat. Tears welled in the older woman's eyes. "The small room at the back," Maud said, her voice thick. "It's yours. You can help with the laundry and the kitchen to earn your keep." She didn't say thank you, but the words hung in the air between them, more powerful than if they had been spoken. Ruth Ann had found her place, not through a liar's letter, but through the skill in her own 2 hands. Life at the boarding house was hard. Ruth Ann's days were a blur of lye soap, boiling water, and the endless turning of sheets through the mangle. Her hands, once soft, became red and raw. But it was honest work, and each night she fell into her narrow bed too exhausted to feel the full weight of her loneliness. She saw the big rancher, Bridger, when he came to town for supplies. He never spoke to her. He never even seemed to look in her direction. But she felt his presence like a change in the weather. He was a fixed point in this shifting, uncertain world. One morning, she woke before dawn to a chill in the air. When she went out to the woodpile behind the kitchen, she found a neat stack of freshly split pine waiting for her, far more than was usually delivered. It was dry and seasoned and smelled sharply of the forest. She knew with a certainty that had no logic to it that it was Bridger's doing. He had seen her struggling with the damp green wood the week before. The gesture was anonymous and silent, and it warmed her more than any fire. A few weeks later, talk in the dining room was all about Bridger's prize mare. The horse had gone lame, a deep stone bruise that wouldn't heal. The farrier was grim, and Bridger was said to be quieter and colder than ever. The mare, they said, had belonged to his wife, who had died some years back. It was the last living thing he had of her. Ruth Ann felt a pull, a need to help. That afternoon, she walked the 2 miles out to his ranch. The place was vast and the house well built, but it had an air of neglect, as if the heart had gone out of it. She found him in the corral, standing over the beautiful bay mare, whose head hung low in misery. "Mr. Bridger," she said, her voice small in the open air. He turned, his face a mask of thunder. "What do you want?" "I heard about your mare," she said, refusing to be intimidated. "My mother taught me some things for livestock. A poultice, it might draw the poison out." He stared at her, his stormy eyes searching her face for some trick. "The farrier's done all he can." His voice was a dismissal. "It won't harm her to try," Ruth Ann persisted, her chin lifted. "What have you got to lose?" He looked from her to the horse, and the hard line of his jaw softened almost imperceptibly. The desperation won. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. For the next hour, they worked in a strange, companionable silence. She directed him to bring hot water and bran, and she gathered comfrey leaves she found growing near the creek bed. She mashed them into a pulp, her movements deft and sure. The mare, usually skittish, stood placidly under her gentle touch, seeming to draw comfort from her quiet murmurs. Bridger watched her, his silence no longer hostile, but attentive. He watched her hands, so competent and gentle, as she packed the warm poultice around the horse's hoof and wrapped it in clean sacking. "You'll need to change it twice a day," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on her face. "I'll see you get back to town," he said, his voice rough. It was not an offer, but a statement. The wagon ride back was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken things that had passed between them in the dusty corral. The mare began to heal. Bridger started finding reasons to come to town more often. He would take his meals in Maud's dining room, always sitting at a small table by himself. But his eyes would find Ruth Ann as she moved between the tables, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates. He never said much more than "Ma'am" or "much obliged," but his presence was a shield. The other boarders, the rough men who worked the freight lines, began to treat her with a new respect. No one trifled with anything that Bridger had laid a silent claim to. The annual church social was the biggest event of the year in Redemption. Maud insisted Ruth Ann go, even lending her a dress of her own daughter's, a simple blue calico that brought out the colour of her eyes. Ruth Ann felt exposed and out of place among the town's families. The women whispered behind their hands, their eyes following her. She was the outsider, the charity case. Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife and the self-appointed Queen of Redemption Society, cornered her near the lemonade table. "It's so good of Maud to take you in," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "A woman in your position must be so grateful for any kindness." The insult was clear, wrapped in the guise of Christian charity. Before Ruth Ann could respond, a shadow fell over them. Bridger stood there, his large frame blocking out the lantern light. He had on a clean shirt and his hair was slicked down with water. He looked impossibly large and solid in the crowded church hall. He completely ignored Mrs. Gable. His eyes were only for Ruth Ann. "Miss Ruth Ann," he said, and it was the first time she had heard him say her full name. It sounded different in his mouth, like something valuable. "I'd be obliged if you'd join me for a cup of coffee." It was not a question. He placed a hand on the small of her back to guide her through the crowd. The touch was brief, proper, but it sent a shock straight through her. The entire hall went quiet, watching as the town's wealthiest, most reclusive rancher publicly aligned himself with the abandoned woman who worked at the boarding house. Mrs. Gable's face was a study in fury. Bridger didn't notice. He was building a wall around Ruth Ann with nothing more than his presence. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she felt safe. That night marked a turning point. Bridger's quiet protection had elevated Ruth Ann, but it had also made her a target. Mrs. Gable, publicly slighted, was not a woman to forgive. She saw Ruth Ann not just as an upstart, but as a direct threat to her plans for her own plain, unmarried daughter, whom she had long hoped would catch Bridger's eye and his fortune. Her veiled insults turned into a campaign of whispers. She began by writing letters, a discreet inquiry sent back to the town in Ohio from which Ruth Ann had come. She presented it as a charitable concern, a desire to help this poor, displaced woman reconnect with her family. The response, when it came, was a weapon she had only dreamed of. Ruth Ann had not been a simple teacher. Her father had been a respected man, a town councillor, until he was caught in an embezzlement scheme, stealing from the very people who had trusted him. He had taken his own life in disgrace, leaving his family destitute and shamed. Ruth Ann had left town not just for a job, but to escape the stain of her father's sins. Mrs. Gable twisted the truth into something ugly and sharp. The story she spread through the sewing circles and over the mercantile counter was different. Ruth Ann wasn't the victim of her father's crime, she was an accomplice. She was a woman on the run, a grifter who had likely been in on the scheme herself. Why else would she come so far? Why else would she arrive with no one to meet her? Abernathy hadn't abandoned her. He had likely discovered her true nature and fled. The whispers took root in the fertile soil of suspicion that always lies just beneath the surface of a small town. The atmosphere in Redemption chilled. The smiles that had started to greet Ruth Ann faded. The friendly nods were replaced with averted eyes. The men at the boarding house who had once treated her with gruff respect now watched her with narrowed, calculating gazes. Even Maud grew distant, her face etched with a worried frown. She was a businesswoman, and her boarding house depended on the town's goodwill. Harbouring a woman of questionable character was bad for business. Bridger was away on a 3-week cattle drive to the railhead at Dodge City. His absence created a vacuum, and Mrs. Gable's poison filled it completely. Ruth Ann felt the walls closing in. She was isolated again, but this time it was worse. Before, she had been invisible. Now she was seen, and seen as something tainted. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Ruth Ann was in the mercantile buying thread for Maud when Mrs. Gable entered, flanked by 2 other townswomen. She walked directly to Ruth Ann, a letter held aloft in her gloved hand like a death warrant. "Miss Ruth Ann," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "I have just received the most troubling correspondence from your former home." She proceeded to read a carefully edited version of the letter, painting a picture of Ruth Ann as a cunning thief who had fled justice. "It seems you are not who you pretend to be. You came here under false pretenses, preying on the good nature of this town, and now you have set your sights on ensnaring our most prominent citizen with your lies." The store fell silent. The storekeeper stopped weighing beans. A mother pulled her child closer. All eyes were on Ruth Ann, burning with accusation. Her face was pale, but she stood tall. "My father made a terrible mistake," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "A mistake he paid for with his life. I have done nothing wrong." "So you say," Mrs. Gable sneered. "But we only have the word of a swindler's daughter." She turned to the assembled shoppers. "Is this the kind of person we want in Redemption?" No one spoke in Ruth Ann's defense. Their silence was her conviction. She dropped the thread on the counter, turned and walked out of the store. Her head was held high, but her heart was shattered. The walk back to the boarding house was the longest of her life. Every window seemed to hold accusing eyes. That evening, Maud came to her room. She wouldn't meet Ruth Ann's gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, twisting her apron in her hands. "But the boarders are complaining. They're threatening to leave. I can't lose my business, Ruth Ann. You have to understand." Ruth Ann understood perfectly. "I'll be gone in the morning," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. There was no point in fighting. She had been tried and convicted by rumour. She packed her small trunk again. It hadn't gotten any heavier, but it felt like it was filled with stones. She had nothing. She had nowhere to go. The hope that had begun to bloom in her heart had been ripped out by the roots. She would take the morning train, heading west or east. It didn't matter. All that mattered was leaving redemption behind. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, the loneliest woman in the world, waiting for the dawn. Bridger rode into town 2 days early, pushing his men and his horse hard. A nagging unease had settled in his gut on the trail, a feeling that something was wrong back home. He left his horse at the livery and walked toward the boarding house, looking forward to a hot meal and, he admitted to himself, the quiet sight of Ruth Ann. The town felt different, tense. He saw Mrs. Gable on the street, and she gave him a triumphant, knowing smile that set his teeth on edge. He found Maud scrubbing her front porch with a furious energy. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Maud burst into tears. Between sobs, the whole ugly story came tumbling out. The rumors, the confrontation in the store, her own cowardice. "She left on the morning train yesterday," she finished, her voice thick with regret. "I tried to stop her. I told her to wait for you, but she said there was nothing left for her here." A cold, quiet rage settled over Bridger, a rage directed at the town, at Mrs. Gable, and most of all at himself for leaving her unprotected. He turned without a word and strode back toward the livery. He didn't know where the train was headed, but he knew the next stop was Willow Creek, a full day's ride. He could beat it if he rode hard. Just as he reached the end of the street, a shout went up. "Help! Someone help! He's fallen in the well!" A crowd was gathering near the old community well by the station, its stone wall crumbling. Panic was a fever spreading through the small group. It was the baker's son, a boy of 6, who had been playing where he shouldn't. Bridger pushed his way through. The men were shouting useless advice, fumbling with a thick rope. "He's not answering," the baker cried, his face as white as flour. "I think he's hurt." Suddenly, a wagon came rattling down the road from the east, kicking up a plume of dust. It was the mail cart from Willow Creek. The driver pulled up, his eyes wide. "The bridge is out," he yelled, "washed out by a flash flood. Train's stuck on the other side. Won't be through till tomorrow, maybe longer." Bridger's heart lurched. She was still in Willow Creek. He could find her. But first there was the boy in the well. He took charge, his voice cutting through the panic. "Get a lighter rope. Someone get a lantern." As they scrambled to follow his orders, another, calmer voice cut through the noise. "Wait!" Every head turned. Standing on the edge of the crowd, a small trunk at her feet, was Ruth Ann. She must have gotten off the mail cart, having found no other way back. Her face was pale and tired, but her eyes were clear and focused. She walked to the edge of the well, ignoring the shocked stares and guilty murmurs. "Lowering a man is too slow, and the opening is too narrow," she said, her voice carrying an unshakable authority. "And we don't know if the air is good at the bottom. Shouting will only use up what he has." She turned to the crowd. "We need to send air down first." She looked at the women. "Your aprons, your petticoats. Tie them together to make a fan. We will force air down the shaft." Then she turned to the men. "We don't need a heavy rope, we need a loop. Something he can get a hand or a foot through, even if he's groggy." She was not asking, she was commanding. And in the face of a real crisis, the town's petty judgments dissolved. They saw not a swindler's daughter, but a woman who knew what to do when they were all lost in panic. Bridger watched her, a fierce pride swelling in his chest. This was the woman he had seen from the very beginning. While the women frantically worked the cloth fan, sending waves of fresh air into the darkness, Ruth Ann knelt by the well's opening. She didn't shout. She began to speak, her voice low and soothing, a steady stream of comforting words that dropped like pebbles into the deep silence. "We're here, son. We're coming for you. You just have to hold on." When the looped rope was ready, Bridger lowered it himself, following her quiet instructions. After a tense minute, he felt a faint, unmistakable tug. Slowly, carefully, he began to pull. The whole town held its breath. A small dirt-streaked head appeared, then a pair of shoulders. The boy was coughing and crying, but he was alive. His mother snatched him up, sobbing with relief. The town seemed to exhale as one, and then they turned to look at Ruth Ann, who was standing back, her face composed. They saw her then, really saw her. Mrs. E. Gable, standing at the back of the crowd, looked small and petty, her venom rendered impotent by a simple act of courage and competence. Bridger walked through the now silent crowd until he was standing in front of Ruth Ann. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at her, his heart in his eyes. He had ridden to rescue her, but in the end, she had rescued the town's child and in doing so had rescued herself, and she had rescued him from the cold, empty silence he had lived in for so long. He reached out and took the handle of her trunk. Then he looked at the townspeople, his gaze sweeping over them, cold and hard as iron. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing with power, "showed more decency and courage in 5 minutes than any of you have shown in a month." He turned his back on them, a dismissal more profound than any curse. He looked at Ruth Ann. "My offer of a job still stands," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. "Housekeeper at my ranch." She looked up at him, at his stormy grey eyes that were no longer stormy, but clear and steady. She saw the truth there. It wasn't just a job, it was a promise. It was a home. "I accept," she said, and a small true smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing at all, and together they walked toward his wagon, leaving the shamed and silent town behind them. The following months passed in a rhythm of quiet healing. The house on Bridger's ranch, once a monument to grief, slowly came back to life. Ruth Ann planted an herb garden by the kitchen door, its green shoots a defiant splash of color against the brown earth. The scent of rosemary and thyme drifted through the open windows. She aired out the rooms that had been closed for years, letting the sunlight banish the stale shadows. She found a pile of his late wife's books and started reading them aloud in the evenings, her voice a soft murmur in the lamp-lit parlor. Bridger, in turn, began to mend things he had long let slide. He fixed the loose shutter that banged in the wind. He repaired the porch steps she was always careful to step over. He built her a set of sturdy shelves for her preserving jars without being asked, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the planed wood. They were small acts, silent conversations that spoke of care and attention. They rarely spoke of the past, his or hers. But one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the prairie bleed into a bruised purple sunset, he finally broke his long silence. He told her about his wife, Sarah, how she had loved the sound of the meadowlarks in the morning. He told her about his son, Daniel, who had been taken by a fever in a single brutal winter week. He spoke of the guilt that had walled him off from the world, the feeling that he had failed to protect them. Ruth Ann didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply listened, her presence a quiet testament of understanding. When he was finished, his voice thick with unshed tears, she reached out and placed her hand over his, a simple gesture of connection, of shared sorrow. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily, and he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. "You didn't fail them," she said softly. "You just survived them. And that is the hardest thing of all." In that moment, he felt the last of the ice around his heart crack and melt away. He had been the loneliest rancher, a man rattling around in the shell of his own life. But she had filled the empty spaces. She had saved him not from a physical threat, but from the slow, creeping death of loneliness. The town of Redemption, for its part, had been humbled, Mrs. Abel found her social standing greatly diminished. People looked at her differently now, remembering her cruelty more than her influence. They sent tentative offerings of peace out to the ranch, a pie left on the fence post, a message of goodwill sent with a ranch hand. Ruth Ann accepted them with a grace that shamed them more than any anger could have. She belonged not to the town, but to the land, and to the quiet man who stood beside her. One crisp autumn afternoon, Bridger found her by the corral, talking softly to the bay mare, who was now completely sound, her coat gleaming in the sun. He came and stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. He held out his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a meadowlark with its head thrown back in song. He had whittled it on the long nights of the cattle drive, thinking of her. "It's not much," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She took it, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. It was everything. It was a promise of mornings, of songs, of a shared life. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "This place," he said, looking out at the vast expanse of his land, his home. "It was just a piece of land, a house full of ghosts. You made it a home again, Ruth Ann." He said her name like a prayer. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion, but about peace. It was a kiss of arrival, a confirmation that the long, lonely journey was finally over. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the porch, and for the first time they looked not like threats, but like a welcoming shade. He was no longer the loneliest rancher, and she was no longer the woman no one came for. They had, against all odds, come for each other.